Right now, we're going to get you an exclusive interview with the Union Information and Broadcasting Minister Manish Tewari. When the Prime Minister says it will not be business as usual, what exactly does he mean? And does it also indicate that all the equity, the effort, the time that the Prime Minister invested post Sharm el Sheikh, post 26/11 in trying to mend bridges with Pakistan, was that all a mistaken endeavor? Here is the Union Information and Broadcasting Minister Manish Tewari in an exclusive conversation.
The BJP is gunning for the UPA government, accusing the Congress of soft peddling with Pakistan. Joining us now is Union Information and Broadcasting Minister Manish Tewari. Thank you very much for joining us on Hot Pursuit, Manish. Sushma Swaraj, leader of the opposition, came out and said if they've severed the head of one of our soldiers, we must sever the head of 10 of their soldiers. The BJP is demanding retaliation. Yashwant Sinha called for a controlled military action. The sense is that the UPA government is soft peddling on Pakistan.
And I think the sense is completely erroneous. If you were to rewind to the first day on which this dastardly incident took place, and if you look at each reaction which the government has articulated, it has been a very calibrated articulation. Eventually, there is a need to realize that both the diplomatic and the tactical responses really lie to the remit of the national security establishment. And they need to be given the flexibility and the confidence that as they go along calibrating the action, and you've seen a couple of steps unfold in the last few days, that the nation completely stands behind them.
To the contrary, it can be argued that the Prime Minister's office is tying the hands of the national security establishment. We saw the army chief come out and say yesterday that India will retaliate at a time of its choosing. Immediately after that, the External Affairs Minister Salman Khurshid came out and said, no, we need to be diplomatic, we need to be very moderate, we can't up the ante. It almost seems as if the army wants to strike back. The soldiers want to strike back for Pakistan, having severed the head of one of their own, but the government is holding them back.
Well, I think the hair splitting which you've attempted is completely out of line. The Prime Minister,
I've just stated facts.
The Prime Minister is the head of the cabinet and therefore is per facto is head of the national security establishment. There are no Chinese walls. You know, this is a seamless response, and this is a seamless establishment in terms of how it takes decisions. So therefore, to say that A is hawkish and B is dovish, or A wants to take the lead and B is pulling him back, I think it's completely a wrong way of interpreting it. I mean, coming as it is from you, a person who I respect and I know understands the nuances of how strategic responses are formulated and how they are disseminated, you know, with all due respect, find it a little out of line.
No, I'll tell you what is out of line, Manish. The fact that we've been engaging with Pakistan with a policy of unending appeasement, regardless of what Pakistan does, whether it is Kargil, whether it is 26/11, the first reaction of the Indian establishment is to forgive, to forget, and to move on. Today, what we are seeing is the outpouring of anger and frustration as a consequence of the UPA policy.
Well, I think there is no unending appeasement or undulating appeasement, as you put it. Whether it was 26/11, or whether it were incidents which preceded 26/11, where there was complete tangible evidence that the perpetrators were either from Pakistan or the links went back to Pakistan, the Indian establishment across governments has been cohesive and holistic in its response. But let's understand that there is a certain strategic geography to the subcontinent, and that strategic geography also has to be factored in when you make your choices. It's all very easy to sit on the sidelines and really take a stand, you know, which for the lack of a better word may sound hawkish. It is popular also.
It's a nationalistic opinion.
But when you really have to walk the talk and you have to ensure that coercive pressure or pressure is built upon a neighbor to get them to deliver, you have to calibrate it. And therefore, that is why I started off by saying that the full spectrum of options, diplomatic, strategic or tactical, must be available to the national security establishment, to the diplomatic establishment, to exercise them at a time and a place of their own choosing.
You're saying we've been applying coercive pressure. So am I to then reach the conclusion that our policy of applying pressure on Pakistan has failed? Because despite all this talk of Aman Kiyasha, at the end of the day, the Pakistani army on the ground hasn't changed. Two of our soldiers were killed. One had his head severed, and there's nothing the Indian government could do with its policy of engagement to prevent it.
Well, again, I think you're trying to put the cart before the horse. When you talk about a response, whether it is a diplomatic response, and since you specifically brought up this inhuman incident, if you rewind back to day one, Government of India called in the Pakistani High Commissioner, told him categorically in specific terms that this is not on. And going from there till today, when the Prime Minister stated that it cannot be business as usual, if you look at it, there has been a calibrated response which has come from different levels of government. And that is why I'm saying that it requires a certain degree of both finessing as well as flexibility in order to do things.
No, but we've reached an impasse. You're insisting that it was Pakistani army regulars who were responsible for the beheadings. The Pakistani establishment denies this outright. You've summoned the ambassador, given him a showdown. What does that leave us with? Where are we? Pakistan refuses to acknowledge the truth. What will you do about it?
Well, if you go back to 26/11, Rahul, initially Pakistan was refusing to acknowledge that the perpetrators of 26/11 came from Pakistan. And when pressure was applied, not only by India, but an international coalition was built up, and they brought to bear sustained and consistent pressure on Pakistan. You saw wilting. First of all, you saw an acknowledgement, then you saw the arrest, and then you saw a criminal trial starting to unfold. Maybe that criminal trial may not have reached its logical conclusion insofar as we are concerned, but to say that the application of pressure in the past has not brought tangible results, I don't think would be a fair read of the situation.
When the Prime Minister tells us, and when we spoke to him at Army Day earlier this afternoon, he said it cannot be business as usual. Can you explain what that means?
Well, it means what it says.
What exactly does it mean when it comes down to putting pen on paper?
Well, I think if the Prime Minister of India makes a statement which is as profound and as full of gravitas as telling a neighbor or telling Pakistan that it cannot be business as usual, you will really have to account for the inhuman action which your soldiers have perpetrated or your personnel has perpetrated. That is sending a very clear and straight message that the country and the establishment has taken this action very seriously, and we are not going to let it go.
But many would argue that the Prime Minister's hand is being forced because he's seen across the country there is a mood of outrage and frustration with his government's policy because Pakistan is not delivering. Therefore, the Prime Minister, who inherently is highly dovish when it comes to Pakistan, is forced to come out and publicly say it can't be business as usual because he realizes his policy has got us nowhere.
Well, the first assumption on which your question is based with regard to the fact that the Prime Minister is dovish is completely and absolutely impeachable.
How would you describe his relationship with Pakistan?
And the reason why I say that is, if you extrapolate it and take it to another paradigm, here is a Prime Minister who single-handedly made the world dismantle the entire non-proliferation architecture which was put in place after the 1974 peaceful nuclear explosion. It does not require, or it is not a dovish man, who can make the entire world, really bend to the will of India.
When I called him a dovish about the relationship with Pakistan, let's restrict it to that because there's trade, there's commerce. It's not just national security when it comes to the nuclear architecture.
So therefore, when you extrapolate that to the Pakistani paradigm, here is a Prime Minister who's realist, who's very realistic about what India's security imperatives are. He concurrently hoped that the impetus on trade, the impetus on commerce, would possibly pave the way for a more responsible response from Pakistan. But when you see that response not forthcoming, then the Prime Minister has the ability, and he has demonstrated it time and again over the last 9 years, not only to be tough, but also to convey a message which is unambiguous and which is loud and clear.
People would argue that the writing was on the wall. He refused to read it at that time.
Rahul, there are certain people who are voluble in terms of their articulation. There are other people who have inherent internal steel in them. They do not need to be very verbose in their expression, but when they speak, and in the case of the Prime Minister, because he's very circumspect with his words, the full import of that goes home to the interlocutors very clearly.
No, so let's try and understand this better and fully. What does no business as usual really mean? Will we strike back militarily? That's what Yashwant Sinha, the former foreign minister, is asking for. That's what the army chief and the Northern Army commander have hinted, that we will retaliate where we need to. Are military options on the table?
Well, I think if you were to sort of interpret not business as usual in its literal sense, it for the time being means that Prime Minister needs to account. It means that Pakistan needs to account for its actions in totality. And as I earlier stated, that when you have a national security establishment or a diplomatic establishment which is dealing with a situation like this, there is a full spectrum of options which you have the ability to calibrate.
No, so what why don't you articulate that for us? What exactly? There was a meeting yesterday, I'm told, where the three service chiefs met the National Security Advisor. The Prime Minister was there. There was a full briefing. What is it that's been worked out? Are we going to cut back on trade ties, people-to-people ties? What is it that you intend to tell Pakistan to let Islamabad know that we are not going to accept their denial?
Well, aren't you seeing it unfolding on a daily basis? Haven't you seen that the visa agreement has been put on hold? Haven't you seen certain other actions?
But the BJP is taking credit for it, because the BJP came, struck a belligerent note. The government realizes it seemed out of sync with the national mood. Therefore, this was put on hold at the last moment. Is that not a fact?
Well, the Bharatiya Janata Party, I think, should really introspect on their own tenure from 1999 to 2004 and then try and extrapolate their position vis-a-vis the UPA position. And one thing which comes out very clearly is that the UPA position has been extremely consistent. It has been a position of non-appeasement. And since, we are at a very critical point in time, I do not want to go over the entire sequence of Kargil, Lahore, Agra, Parliament attack, then picking up the threads with Pakistan, and then trying to make a comparison as to how we've handled it over the last 8 years. But the facts speak for themselves. That is why it is important that at times like this, the entire country, which includes the opposition, which includes all other influential sections of our public discourse, really must stand behind both the diplomatic and the security establishment, because they have the fundamental remit given to them by the people of India, and they are the professionals who are best placed to decide as to what out of the menu of options which they would like to choose from.
Pakistan is in complete denial. Constantly, each person we speak to in the Pakistani establishment says, where is the proof? In 2611, you had telephone recordings, you had GPS information, all of which pointed back towards Pakistan. You had hard proof which you laid before Islamabad.
Well,
what will you do in this case?
Well, Rahul, if you go back to the initial days after 2611, you saw a similar denial. In fact, it is only when events started unfolding and the evidence started emerging and the international coalition which India put in place started exerting pressure that you saw them, take one step back at a time. So therefore, we've had experience of dealing with this earlier. This situation is in a very safe pair of hands. People who are not hawkish, but people who are absolutely realistic when it comes to India's national security concerns and India's national security priorities. So make no mistake that here is a government which has taken very, very serious note of the inhuman manner in which our soldiers have been treated.
There are words and then there is action. So therefore, after 2611, we heard similar words. The moment anger subsided in India, the government got back to business as usual. Now you're striking a belligerent tone because you understand the mood in the nation. People would reasonably wonder whether once the anger subsides, we'll get back to business as usual.
Not true at all. In the sense, if you go back to 2611,
because after that, everyone in the government spoke about the need to move on.
No,
Pakistan hasn't delivered on 2611. We are talking of moving on.
In fact, if you look at the entire sequence of events over the past 4 years, moving on was always conditional on Pakistan delivering. Whether it was the defense minister or it was the home minister, who's now the finance minister, if you go back to each statement which has been articulated by them, all of them talk about the need for Pakistan to deliver on 2611. Whenever there has been a conversation, even at the apex level, the one thing that has been driven home is that bringing the perpetrators of 2611 to justice is non-negotiable. So therefore, to say, that when public anger subsides, there is amnesia and the government wants to move on, that is absolutely not the case. Yes, there is a certain logic of history, there's a certain logic of geography when it comes to Indo-Pakistan relations. We lived cheek to jowl. Those realities and various other strategic realities need to be kept in mind when you calibrate the response. And that's why I'm saying what really ties the hands of the establishment at times is when the discourse tends to become hysterical. There is absolutely no problem with expressing outrage. I think the entire nation personally feels violated in the manner in which these soldiers have been dealt with. But then we must have confidence in the people who have been entrusted with the remit that they will deliver. And you've heard it from various interlocutors who have this responsibility, assuring the nation that yes, we will do it at a time and place with an instrument of our choosing, diplomatic or otherwise, when we make that decision.
The family of the slain soldier is saying that the government is putting pressure on them. They were on a hunger fast. They were asked to call that off. They came on record and told our journalists that they're under pressure. The government doesn't want them to continue being on a fast. Can you at least promise the family that the government will do what it can to get the head back? Because it's a very emotional issue for the family. Their son's head has been severed off his body and the government doesn't seem to be doing much to get the head back.
Well, I think the sympathies of the entire nation are with the families of these two soldiers who unfortunately were treated in this manner by the Pakistani armed forces personnel. There is absolutely no question of putting pressure on anybody. Not only is there sympathy, but there is solidarity. And as I earlier said, that here is an establishment which is very cognizant of its responsibility and equally serious with regard to the enormity of the crime which has been committed.
But there is a massive turmoil in Pakistan. There's a million-man march. Islamabad is shut down. There were lots of rumors floating all across Pakistan of the president possibly fleeing. Given the current turmoil in Pakistan, are you at all hopeful that there will be any resolution on the demands that India is making? Because it almost seems as if that country is disintegrating at this time.
Well, Pakistan's internal problems are really intrinsic to it. We as a country or as any Westphalian state deal with the entity which is there in office at that particular point in time. So therefore, I am not going to go into as to, whether Pakistan is in turmoil or Pakistan is not in turmoil. Insofar as we are concerned, we have a very short focused mandate which the Prime Minister today articulated very clearly that it cannot be business as usual till the time.
Why did it take so long for the Prime Minister to come to this realization?
For the simple reason that Prime Ministers do not speak off the bat. That's why I took you back to the day on which this incident took place and then led you through the calibration of response which has come from the Indian establishment. And that is how responsible diplomatic and strategic establishments really go about not only nuancing but actually optimizing the full spectrum of options which is available to them.
Is it the case of the Indian government that this was a tactical ploy by some junior level officers or soldiers in the Pakistani establishment? Or do you believe that what happened with our soldiers at Mendhar had the full support of Rawalpindi Army Headquarters?
Well, I am not in a position to make that value judgment because the finer details of that do not fall to my remit as the information
That's what the Army
Broadcasting
Chief
Minister.
said.
That is really for the army establishment, or that is for the defense ministry to make that assessment, with regard to intent, with regard to whether it was localized, or there was a larger design to that. But the fact is that there are two interrelated issues. There is an issue with regard to violation of ceasefire, which has been clearly brought out, that these repeated violations are to push militants into Jammu and Kashmir. And then, of course, is the attendant issue of complete violations of the rules of engagement in the mutilation and the beheading of our soldiers. So, therefore, these are two issues on which there is convergence.
Why don't
and then
we
there
go
has
to
to
the
be an
United Nations or to other international fora and make our case against Pakistan?
Well, I think, again, speaking from experience, it's always been our consistent position.
That's not true. For the Indus Water Treaty, we went
it has been our
to an international forum.
It has been our consistent position that internationalizing bilateral disputes is not our policy. It is not in our interest. And number two, if I recall correctly, if you go back to the Atlantic incident, which took place in the August of 1999, there are questions of jurisdiction also, but that is the subject matter of a completely different debate if you would like to do it.
No,
but
is this not a dialogue with the deaf, Manish? The fact that India insists that the Pakistani army was involved, the Pakistani establishment is in complete denial. Given this current state, how will this situation resolve? Because they refuse to acknowledge the actions of their army.
You possibly asked me these same questions in the days and months after 26/11. And you slowly and gradually found that the instruments and the levers which were used by the Indian establishment, they started yielding results, to the extent that finally the Pakistanis did acknowledge that Kasab was a Pakistani citizen, and then justice played itself out in the Indian context. So therefore, let us not prejudge the issue. Let us not put the cart before the horse. Here is a government, which is extremely committed to doing things in a manner which holds people to account. It should be given the flexibility of exercising those options at a time and place of its choosing.
9 ceasefire violations have already taken place over the last few days. The Pakistani army is planting landmines in the no-man area on both sides of the LOC. Given this, is the ceasefire now not null and void? Should we not annul this ceasefire? It's meaningless.
Now, what do you mean by annulling the ceasefire?
It doesn't hold on the ground.
No, I mean, in
so it's in name only.
What are you suggesting?
I'm saying that does the government believe that the ceasefire still exists?
I think
if it's being violated every day.
I think now we are getting into uncharted waters, because this question itself has certain very ominous implications. It is in the interest of the region as a whole that there must be peace. There must be attendant circumstances which allow us to mitigate and surmount some of the fundamental challenges which face South Asia as a whole. And let us also understand that we have a problem with the Pakistani establishment. We do not have a problem with the Pakistani people.
No, I'm talking specifically about the ceasefire.
Therefore,
a ceasefire indicates that two armies will not fire at each other. That ceasefire is not being followed.
So therefore, if there are violations of the ceasefire taking place, there are institutions and mechanisms in place, which would take care of that, which would surmount that. But to extrapolate from there and draw conclusions, which may be alarmist, may not be the right thing to do at this point.
All right, you've made the case for the government. We leave it to the people to decide where they stand. Manish Tewari for joining us on Hot Pursuit. Thank you so much.